I would like to talk, I've co-authored this with a very capable town planner by the name of Peter Ahmed in the city of Johannesburg, and he approached me last year on the 15th of December and said, we have a crisis, we need to know how many informal structures do we have in the city of Joburg, what can you do to help us? And ironically, we had sold data to the city of Joburg about a year earlier, which had some information in, and we were able to show this to him, and it has been instrumental in changing policy and some of the thinking within Joburg. And when I talk about quantifying human settlements, I'm talking about not just defining where they are, but to be able to give an account of formal versus informal versus townhouses, etc. But also, what is the relationship between residential land use and non-residential land use? Because that has a significant implication on the city. So the idea of today is to just briefly talk about the value of Earth observation in this environment, but also look at what are the types of land uses across the city of Johannesburg, and then touch on two specific and quite well-known settlements, the one being Diepsloot, the other one being Alexandra, and what's the major fundamental differences and what we can draw from doing a very simplistic approach to this. City of Johannesburg, just for background purposes, got about 4 million people living in it, 1.3 million structures or households. It's the largest city in the world not near a lake or coastline or river. And it's also got about 6 million trees. I don't know who counted them, but that's what I was able to get from them a bit earlier. But it's also a focal point for job opportunities in Gauteng and to a degree in the country. The challenges they face are simple. They have a massive housing backlog. And how are we going to address that? And that's the one thing they need to quantify. The second thing was, there's a spatial challenge, as they call it. And that challenge is about how do we stop the marginalization of the poor? Because they are typically living in areas very far away from their job opportunities or where they transact in the day. And the amount of money that they spend on transportation as a function of their salaries is significantly higher than you and I, who maybe drive further, but we have our own cars. And that's the type of challenge that they're dealing with. And they talk about the spatial economy of the city. What's going on in the city? How are we going to drive urban development? How are we going to basically mold urban development to make it better and make it more sense? Just touching on some of the issues that they have. And there's a magical line that goes around North Reef Road, I think it's called, in Johannesburg. If you look at that picture, there's technically a split in the city of Joburg, which from the north to the south, in what type of development happens. In the north, it's all privately funded. In the south, it's government funded. Which the backlogs, there's significant backlogs in these areas. This is around Katlehong, Vosloorus, this is Soweto, that's Alexandra, and that's Diepsloot. And then they have these challenges of hotspots, and one of the we all know about it, power. Where are there power limitations in the city of Joburg? Where are there sewer limitations? Where are there road limitations? And then where are there, what's the last one, water limitations? And those are clearly limiting where you can develop and where you can't develop. A simple example is, if you're in a residential suburb and there's not enough power, you can't allow additional residential structures to be built, but you can potentially allow retail and commercial structures to be built because the power usage is different. The one is nighttime, the one is daytime. So that's why it's crucial to understand the full land use of an area, not just the residential land use. Think of it, your census focuses purely on where people sleep. We have very little idea what they do in the day and how they get there and what type of things they're working. The urban form, as they call it, it's about accessibility to jobs. It's about an efficient public transport system. And we're seeing this now. We're seeing the BRTs, we're seeing Gautrain, we're seeing the improvements in the Metro Rail network, etc., etc. How do we limit urban development? There's a big question in Johannesburg. There's about 1 million square meters of open office space in Joburg at the moment. Should you allow the development of one more office building in Joburg if you've got 1 million square meters of open and not rented space? It's a question. You can pose that. Is politics allowed to dictate that if a building's of not any quality and standard and people are renting it, then you shouldn't allow them to build another one? But it's a real question that has to be answered. Do we allow densification? Do we force densification? Meaning, are we going to try raise the densities in certain areas. What are the environmental factors? And in the case of Johannesburg, what's the link to other cities? It's surrounded on the one side by Ekurhuleni, Tshwane in the north, Sedibeng District Municipality, and in the bottom you've got, you've got West Rand on the west and Sedibeng in the south. So it's blocked in. There's nothing, they can't go anywhere. And how are we going to resolve that? There's got this dichotomy of all our South African cities, where in one area called Zandspruit, you have two different types of residential structures, and we have that all over this country, and how we're going to address those things. So let's see the value of Earth observation. And when I'm talking about Earth observation, it's the use of aerial photography, the work that Aslam and Julie are doing in creating aerial photos, and what can we do with that to assist these town planners at a very detailed level. This is an example of Nunsiville. Nunsiville is just north of Krugersdorp, where if you look at the yellow lines, you see the cadastre. In the left, there's an informal settlement on top of a township layout. If you were using the cadastre per se and without any other information, you'd have a totally wrong perception of what's going on in that area. On the right, you have a farm portion or agricultural holding with a settlement on top of it. You don't know it's there. In the middle, there's a township establishment, and for some reason, people don't live there. What's going on. So we have to start seeing, this is the real picture on the ground. It's got nothing to do with IDPs, SDFs, existing cadastre, land use plans. It's the reality of what's happening. The second thing is we have this temporal approach that we're able to do using imagery, where we can go back in time and say, what did Deep Sloop look like in '93? What does it look like now? And there's been areas of massive change, and how do we start quantifying that change and turning it into numbers which politicians and town planners can understand. The dynamics of our settlements are such that if you look at those two pictures in the top right, you'll see an area of Alexandra next to the river where there's very little housing at this point in time, and there you see it with a whole informal settlement along there. Your immediate thought is that the top image is maybe June, and the next image is December, and there's been this massive growth. It's exactly the opposite. You found, and if any of you know where Alexandra is, it's in the bottom of a basin, and you're finding that is there's a removal of houses there, and we all know why. There must have been a very high rainfall event in Joburg, and those houses got wet, the flooding, the houses were moved away. So we can't always just see that an area is going to get bigger and densify. We're finding these fluctuations. The next slide looks at a place called Sweetwater in Johannesburg, where the red dots are building structures that we've identified in 2010. And then when you put the image on, you go, wow, you've missed a couple of things. Why have you not mapped all of these houses here? Why haven't you mapped all of those? The irony is that's a 2009 image. By now those houses are gone. They don't exist anymore. So these settlements are changing dramatically all the time. So how do you start understanding that to do service delivery, look at the implications of public transport systems, etc.? So what do we do to quantify these things? How do we approach it? Now in our mind, and we've had this discussion, how do you map land use? How do you quantify land use to a unit? Now there's a thought that says we map to a cadastral unit, we map to a farm portion, etc. What we've been doing is we're physically mapping the building structures and allocating the land use to the structure, very similar to the spot building count, but with about 70 classes of land use and not 6 or 7. And this data can then be interpreted at any level on any land and any parcel, and we're going to show you some examples of that. Fieldwork is expensive. To go out and do a proper, detailed land use survey for a municipality the size of Johannesburg, we're looking at maybe 4 or 5 million rand to do that, conservatively. It's extremely expensive. You also get varying results, because depending on who's doing the project in Region A versus Region B, you're going to get some changes in results. And then the last thing, shouldn't we start looking at things like meter readers? Meter readers are walking past your property every 1 to 2 months. Why aren't they checking things? Why aren't they checking what your house is? Have you built on? Is there construction going on there? And we need to look at alternative ways of collecting our data operationally. There's other data sets, valuation rolls, billing records, etc., etc. Or there's this option of looking at photo interpretation and some very basic remote sensing tools, which gives us a consistent view of an area, a wall-to-wall coverage based on the access to the imagery, and we can repeat it with the same level of accuracy is because we're using a fairly rigorous process to do it. In the case of our feeling on this, and we're using a lot of manual interpretation, when it comes to residential classes, about 95% of the content we can extract with photo interpretation, bottom line. What we can't extract is the number of flats in a high-rise flat complex, or how many units there are in a sectional title scheme based on things like are there duplexes or stat simplexes. It's very difficult to pick that up off an image. When it comes to the non-residential classes, we can get about 60% from an image. What's the difference between a house and a house which has been converted to an office? You're looking for parking areas. How do you identify Aslam's building in Mowbray? There's a flagpole outside of it. It's a government building. And there's some very basic rules that we built up, and we're able to use those to extract that. But there's only so much you can use. There's only so much you can get out of an image, and then we do field work, and we have supplementary or augmentary data sets to assist us.